Welcome to the Green Alliance podcast. We are the charity and think tank that is all about ambitious leadership for the environment. I'm Head of Resources, Libby Peake, and I'm here to talk about the circular economy and what the new government needs to do to actually bring about the policies we need to see to reduce resource use. And there's been lots of really positive developments. The Labour manifesto committed to reducing waste by moving to a circular economy, which was the first time that they ever mentioned the word circular economy in their manifesto. And since the election, Environment Secretary Steve Reed has had real ambition when it comes to this long-neglected area of environmental policy. He's made it one of his top priorities as Secretary of State for the Environment, and he's launching a circular economy task force of the government's own to create a new circular economy strategy for England, underpinned by roadmaps for high-impact sectors. So this is great news and something that we, along with our business partners in the original Circular Economy Task Force, have been calling for a long time. It also, it has to be said, is something that has been theoretically embraced by previous administrations and secretaries of state, notably Michael Gove, who oversaw the creation of the 2018 Resources and Waste Strategy for England, which promised that the plan would see the UK become, and I quote, a world leader in using resources efficiently and reducing the amount of waste we create as a society. Since then, though, the policy delivery has been checkered, to put it mildly, with the National Audit Office concluding that DEFRA does not know what it needs to do to achieve its ambitions over the long term, and the OEP similarly, in a very scathing vein, calling its efforts on the waste hierarchy largely ineffective. So that's all a bit gloomy, and at Green Alliance we don't want to dwell on the past and we're solutions focused, but we think that to understand what went wrong and the why these previous administrations have failed to deliver on their promises, or indeed on the promises of the circular economy more broadly, we thought we first needed to understand the barriers to success. So we set out to diagnose the problem with a series of anonymised interviews with Westminster insiders who had real insight into the failings of previous administrations. And I'm joined now by my colleague Emily Carr, who led on this bit of work, to talk me through the fascinating process. Emily, first of all, can you set out what exactly we did and, without revealing any of the identities involved, the sorts of people whose insights we gained?
Yeah, of course. So we interviewed or sent surveys to 17 different individuals who were close to that decision-making process on resources policy in the former government administrations. And keeping it anonymous, our interviewees included members of the UK Parliament, both MPs and peers, members of some of the parliaments of the devolved administrations, MSPs, members of the Welsh Senedd, former civil servants, former advisors, and some other Westminster insiders who've been working closely on environmental politics for a long time. And when we got them for the interviews, we asked them questions about what was stopping resources being a priority, the kind of experiences they'd had in conversations with MPs and ministers trying to make that case for the circular economy, and what had worked, what hadn't worked, why everyone was just so obsessed with recycling, and asked them, importantly, what they thought could be done to make more progress once we had a different government.
Okay, so those are, I think, key questions that we were asking of some people with some really valuable insights, with a lot of knowledge about how policies get progressed or what stops them being progressed. What did they think were the main barriers to ambitious resources policy?
Yeah, so we interviewed lots of very different types of people. So they had slightly different things to say, but there were three big barriers that kept coming up across the board. The first of which was a lack of knowledge among key decision makers around the circular economy. Some of that was about not really understanding what a circular economy is. There was kind of agreement that it should be about maximising reuse, but then different attitudes came out around whether it should be about reducing consumption, whether the focus should be on waste or at different parts of the waste hierarchy. So there wasn't a kind of really clear consensus on what a circular economy was. And there was also a kind of failure to link the circular economy and resources policy to the other aspects of environmental policy. There were failures to connect it to the nature agenda, to the climate agenda, a perception that these things are in competition, which obviously isn't the case. And what was particularly problematic about this lack of knowledge was that individuals with a lot of power, if they personally had a misunderstanding, that kept getting in the way of progress. But on the flip side, those who did understand could also act as quite important champions. And then a kind of second really big barrier was a misunderstanding of what the public's attitude to all of this stuff was. Politicians, understandably, often want to follow public sentiment. They want to stay popular, and they often believed that the public either don't care about this or are opposed to some ambitious circular economy policies, which isn't the case. They sort of think that the public care about plastic or single issues, the things that show up in David Attenborough documentaries, but they're worried that things that are really interventionist, that tell people to change their behaviour, they're worried if they try and do that, there'll be massive backlash. But this fear really is misplaced. The public are much more receptive to circular economy policies than these people seem to think. And similarly, politicians are really worried about doing anything that's going to increase costs to people, thinking that some circular economy initiatives might increase the cost of products, which isn't always the case. And secondly, cost isn't the only thing that influences the decisions that consumers make. That's another misunderstanding that a lot of decision makers seem to have. And so those misunderstandings kept coming up as a big barrier to progress on this agenda. And finally, as I said before, there's this focus on recycling and that lower end of the waste hierarchy all the time. And what we kept hearing is that it's just because that's easier. Recycling is seen as so much more straightforward for policymakers who kind of lack that knowledge of what the circular economy is, who see that as really complex, a bit nebulous, not very practical. So they continue to just advocate for changes to recycling without thinking bigger and thinking about ambitious policy that would actually have a much bigger impact.
There was a fascinating range of insights there about the fundamental failure of understanding, of communication, of the need to work with people, I think, and really understand their concerns, and an inability to think really big on this agenda and all of the massive wins that you could have. So there's lots of good stuff that we heard, but what I want to know now is what were the juiciest things that we heard from these insiders?
Yeah, as I flagged before, something I found really striking was the influence that individuals could have, that if someone at the top misunderstands something or doesn't believe in something, you can have progress be severely delayed. And I think the thing that was most exciting to me was someone saying to us directly, I think I was part of the problem, that there were people thinking ahead of the curve, but I wasn't one of them. I wasn't thinking beyond recycling. My focus was solely on recycling. And this was an advisor in number 10, so really close to where the power is, where the decisions are getting made and stopping that progress. Someone else spoke about a senior decision maker not being sure about deposit return schemes because they only shopped online, so they couldn't picture how everything would work going into the shop and whether that would inconvenience them. So those levels of individuals actually having a huge impact on causing delays was quite juicy. And I think the other thing that stood out to me was about the lack of parliamentary champions and people being really willing to pass the buck. We were speaking to a Westminster insider who mentioned that one MP spoke up in one debate positively about the circular economy and then just became, for their party, the de facto circular economy advocate. And if you tried to speak to someone else, a different MP, about speaking up, becoming a champion for this issue, they just send you in the direction of that one MP and just pass the buck. And so everything was getting piled at this one person's door. Everyone else was happy to just leave it to them. So it really showed that getting that broad base of champions across Parliament and not just leaving it on this massive pile in front of one person is going to be really, really important.
I think there's lots of work to be done on cultivating a diverse set of champions because there are so many reasons that you should be in favour of the circular economy from all sorts of different angles, which leads me on to the next question, which is sort of instead of the barriers now, what did these insiders have to say about the solutions and what advice did they have for advocates like us and for the government to overcome these obstacles and succeed where others have failed?
They had a lot of advice. So starting with the people like us, the people who want to advocate for the circular economy, the big takeaway is we really need to think about our framing and make it much more effective. We need to stop talking in the abstract and making things really concrete. The circular economy, it's really useful as a catch-all term. It encompasses a lot. It speaks to a lot of different people. But what you need to think about is each time you speak to a new audience, explain the circular economy because and give another reason that properly speaks to them. Talk about resource efficiency, talk about productivity, think about talking about zero waste. People naturally hate waste. That might be the way in. So figure out who your audience is and what's going to speak to them in the best way and bring in some examples. There's some amazing work being done by businesses like those in the Circular Economy Task Force where we can give those concrete examples and show the outcomes and that this stuff's working. So make things specific and frame things much better so it works for your audience. And then for those who are working alongside businesses or with parliamentarians, we really need champions who are willing to create this momentum for the circular economy, to stand up and create this chorus of support across different sectors, kind of across the board for the circular economy. It shouldn't be tied to a singular political party, and it could be for any different motivation. It could be because you really believe in it for economic reasons. It could be because you think this is a social, environmental thing that's really important. But we need lots of people speaking out, sharing those different messages so that we can get people bought into this outside of the classical circular economy bubble that we're in, especially in the business community. If you can have business leaders who are speaking out, addressing some of those government fears about not wanting to be meddling, not want to be interfering, not wanting backlash from business, this could really, really help to gain support, especially from Treasury. And then finally, the advice to the government is to try and get some quick wins, to implement the policies that are going to bring about really rapid benefits that you can see clearly. So you have something to point to. So you build that evidence base of when we do this stuff, it helps people, it creates jobs, it reduces costs. You can see those benefits, and that can build the momentum for further big change. Decision makers and the public really need to see this proof of success in order to start supporting the concept. And so we can counter this sort of skepticism that exists at the moment about circular economy policies and, do they actually work in the real world? So yeah, build that bank of case studies of where it's worked.
Clearly, that's going to be really important. I suppose the sort of Green Alliance gloss on top of that would be that quick wins are well and good, so long as they're part of a coherent long-term plan. And so what we've seen with the previous administrations is that they have got caught, I suppose, on trying to get quick wins on plastic or on packaging, but it hasn't formed part of a coherent whole. And I think we really do have an opportunity now with a new government who's looking to create a circular economy strategy for England that's going to be cross-governmental and going to be looking at all sorts of different high-impact sectors in the long run, or laying the groundwork for roadmaps to them. I think we really do have an opportunity to make sure that quick wins build towards momentum in a way that they haven't ever done in the past. Before we move on to the opportunities we think the new government can grasp, I wanted to dwell a little bit more on what we heard from insiders. As we explained, those interviews were anonymised, but our Circular Economy Task Force happens to benefit from the knowledge of someone who's spent a lot of time on the inside. So I'm really glad to be joined now by Dr. Colin Church, Chief Executive at the Institute of Materials, Minerals and Mining, and the chair of our Circular Economy Task Force. Not to put too fine a point on it, but you were the most senior civil servant working on waste and resources policy for quite some time. And we're really interested to hear in this podcast what the barriers are to getting things right. It'd be great to hear from your perspective. What were the stumbling blocks and why have previous administrations failed to make the progress we want them to?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that it's always dependent on the political context of the day and what the overarching priorities of the government of the day are. And however important an area you think you're working in as a civil servant, if ministers don't see it as being the priority for the department or the government, it's going to be much, much harder to make progress, particularly if what you want to do requires a significant political capital or state money. Both of those things require political support in order for that to happen. So that's always the case. I think that my last few years in the civil service, so up until 2016, that of course was the tail end of the Conservative Lib Dem coalition and the beginning of the majority Conservative government. Obviously, during the coalition times, austerity was a very big driver. So investing in things was a no-no, very difficult thing to do. There was also a continuing interest in deregulation and better regulation, a topic that's obviously very much in the news as we record this podcast following the Grenfell inquiry report. And so the tools that as an environmental policymaker you might have, paying people to do things differently or regulating to stop them from doing things, both of those were constrained by the macro context, if you like, of government. So those are always going to be considerations, and they were big considerations in that period of time. And if I reflect back to earlier days in the civil service in other areas, when one or both of those constraints didn't apply, then it was a different dynamic. I think waste and resources have other aspects that were different perhaps from other areas though. And in no particular order, whenever we had a new minister, we used to joke to ourselves, but it wasn't that funny, that they would come in with their only experience of resource and waste management being their own domestic bin collection. And therefore, if they thought about it at all, they would think of it from that perspective. And perhaps complaints from their local residents about their local bin collections. And of course, household waste is an important part of the picture, but it's still only 12 to 16% of waste arisings. There's an awful lot more to resource and waste policy than just your domestic bins. And they would come in thinking that was all it was about. And they would think that it was a relatively straightforward and simple area of policy. And we would go on to say that 6 months in, they'd become seized of the importance of a strategic approach to resource and waste management. And 7 months in, they'd be reshuffled. And now you can adjust the timings on that, but basically that was pretty much what happened. I mean, we did have one minister coming in who did know what they were talking about, but that was really unusual. Most of the time, they started from no knowledge. So you'd have to spend quite a lot of time bringing them up to speed before they'd understand why they should bother investing any of their political capital in doing things. And I'm sure there are other policy areas across government that had the same thing, but that was a particular barrier to making progress in any agenda related to resource and waste management. I think the second thing kind of flows from that, which is that it is a much more complex system than just your recycling and residual waste bins from home. It is an interlinked system that primarily exists only because of policy and regulation, with an element of market forces laid over the top of that. And so whenever you make a change to that kind of complex system, you get weird and often unexpected, unintended consequences elsewhere. I used to describe it as a partially inflated water balloon. And if you squeeze it in one place, you know it's going to pop up somewhere else, but you don't know where. And then so it squeezes up somewhere else. So you put another hand on it and get that bit that was popping out down, and then it will go somewhere else. And so that system thinking wasn't really there.
I want to sort of reflect now on the current situation, bearing in mind what you've said about what the main constraints you experienced in the past were. So obviously we've got a new government. We have an environment secretary who is already really passionate about the circular economy. So that's, I suppose, very different from what you experienced in the past. There's obviously regulation in the news, but there's also sort of austerity potentially on the horizon, or lots of really tight purse string holding from the Treasury. What do you think the opportunities are for making real progress on this agenda under this government?
I think it's clear that across government, if you are able to position your policy direction as being pro-growth, then you're going to have a much better chance of getting it through and delivering that kind of change. And for the wider circular economy, resource and waste management agenda, there are many aspects of it that are, if done correctly, pro-growth. There is an increasing acceptance of the fact that there is no such thing as a just transition to a low-carbon society, to net zero, without real action on resource efficiency and circular economy. I remember when I was still in government, having tried many times to have the conversation with what was then DEC, now DESNES, about you should really think about this as an issue. It was really, really hard because for classic carbon accounting, the waste sector is basically methane from landfill. That's the only thing that really scores. There's a few other bits and pieces, but that's the main thing that scores. And of course, that was going down because of the landfill tax, because of methane capture from landfill sites. So actually, the waste sector was viewed by climate people as being a positive story in its own right, and you just didn't really need to worry about it. You just get on with it. But of course, there's much more to it. The fact that some of those emissions were being replaced by emissions from energy from waste, particularly as the composition of the waste changes over time, and the role that recycling could have in avoiding primary material production with all of its associated climate impacts, and so on and so forth. And so that was just not understood. And I think now it's increasingly being recognised as being something that's relevant.
So Colin really usefully highlighted there some of the large economy-scale benefits that this government stands to win if it gets its approach to the circular economy right. This is something that we've been thinking about a lot with the members of our Circular Economy Task Force, including WRAP, the Waste and Resources Action Programme. And so I next spoke to Harriet Lamb, WRAP's CEO, and we dug around into the many reasons this government should aim high when it comes to a circular economy.
The circular economy is like our best kept hidden secret because it holds within it the potential to generate, our research shows, another 500,000 jobs by 2030, building on the existing almost 500,000 jobs already in the circular economy. And critically, they could be very dispersed jobs. They could be throughout the country. They don't have to be in one place, highly capital intensive. The circular economy is really about building up the skills so that we can keep goods and services in the economy. We can repair, refurbish, restore, return things to keep them in use. And so absolutely that can generate jobs and it can add to the value added of the economy as a whole. And I think there's no question that this is the way economics is going. And we have the chance in Britain to be ahead of the curve, to be leading the way, to be showing how the jobs of the future will look, how the companies of the future will look. And that's why it's so important that we absolutely throw all our weight behind this exciting new initiative from the new Secretary of State to really put a zero waste circular economy at the heart of what they're doing.
Part of what we've seen, though, is that there seems to be a real block, certainly in terms of Treasury, not necessarily grasping that this is potentially a really big opportunity, that this could actually feed into the growth agenda rather than working against it. So what are the things you think that Treasury in particular needs to know?
Well, I think that's absolutely back to this question of people not realising how many companies are already experimenting with finding the new models of the circular economy. And just to give you some examples that illustrate just how mainstream this is becoming now, take Currys, for example. Currys already have 1,000 people working to repair electrical items. They mended 1 million items last year. That's an incredible example of where the future is. Take another example. 2 companies called like Sojo or Seam, set up by young women who realised there was this incredible connection they could have with companies like Marks and Spencer's, like Selfridges, where you take your goods and clothes back to those companies and they make sure they get repaired and delivered back to your home. And so they're becoming more and more mainstream and everybody's trying.
You mentioned about the carbon benefits of reducing our material use. And one of the things we heard, which was quite interesting in our background research with parliamentarians, was that they saw the resources agenda, the circular economy agenda, as being in conflict with the net zero agenda rather than them being one and the same thing. So clearly we've got some messaging that we need to do. And please just tell us right now why that is wrong and why those two crises are so intertwined.
Well, we have in-depth research, which we've also done with yourselves at Green Alliance, that shows this scale of which the circular economy can reduce emissions. And so you've got the technical research. But I just think logically, it's obvious that if you buy second-hand furniture, second-hand clothes, that you're getting things repaired, restored, refurbished, and only at end of life, and then you're getting them recycled, that logically that is a lower carbon footprint and a lower water footprint, and therefore also a lower impact on nature, because you're keeping those products that have all the embedded carbon that's gone into making them, you're keeping them going for longer. It's absolutely logical.
As Harriet says, it's absolutely logical that using fewer resources will help reduce our environmental impact. And to start looking at it from another angle, it's absolutely logical that reducing your need to extract certain critical raw materials will also bring resilience to the wider economy, particularly for economically vital sectors like renewable energy. I asked Iain Gulland, Chief Executive of Zero Waste Scotland and another member of our Circular Economy Task Force, to explain more.
I think one of the key areas that we've been certainly working with Green Alliance and others is thinking about the utilisation of materials in the kind of net zero infrastructure space. So obviously, certainly in Scotland, there's a huge push for more infrastructure, whether that's onshore, offshore wind, heat pumps, etc. But what we actually realise is that whilst we need that infrastructure, it needs to be deployed at pace in terms of reducing carbon emissions. It uses a hell of a lot of materials, and new materials, particularly called critical raw materials, things like lithium and cobalt and even copper, etc., at a scale that we've never seen before. And I think there's a real challenge there as we deploy that, exactly what's the impact of those new resources being consumed in our economy. And that's not just a Scottish issue. So I guess the reason why we're very interested at the UK level is, we're deploying all of that infrastructure across the UK. In fact, it's a global movement to decarbonise, particularly our energy systems, and even thinking about electric vehicles and mobility as well. So there's a real challenge there. But at the same time, if we start to think about all of the materials that we already have in circulation, certainly in Scotland, we have the decommissioning of the oil and gas infrastructure in the North Sea. So that is releasing a lot of the materials that we could definitely utilise as we deploy that new infrastructure for net zero. And that's a huge opportunity. That's an opportunity for individual businesses. It's an opportunity for the economy in terms of jobs, redeployment of skills, and definitely in terms of, security and resilience going forward. It really helps us if we start to make more of the materials that we already have rather than relying on virgin materials to be kind of mined, etc., from other parts of the world.
And I suppose one of the things that would be useful to highlight to the government is that there is a real role for policy in this space. It's not that businesses aren't being developed in the UK at the scale that they need to remanufacture, reuse and recycle these materials. And it feels like there's a brief window where we might be able to establish a really secure supply chain and do a lot more of this domestically, but we might miss that. So what are the key things that we need to see from government to make sure that we don't miss the opportunities?
You could argue we're still, a lot of the policies that we see both, at Scottish level and at UK level are still designed around a kind of linear economy, thinking about, those materials as waste and just thinking it from a purely environmental point of view, which is hugely important. But we need to start thinking about an economic opportunity. So that needs different types of policy framing, needs to be thinking more about how do we create advantage for more circular practices in businesses? How do you make it more attractive for businesses to be in the space rather than just kind of say, you need to be doing this? Ultimately, we need, a much more dynamic policy space, and we need innovation. We need much more innovative thinking around those policies, particularly at UK level, thinking about taxation, thinking about other levers that could really help change the dynamics. So we're not just levelling the playing field, we're actually tilting the playing field and, to the advantage of circularity.
I was interested in Iain's point about the need to tilt the playing field towards circularity, as it very much feels as though historically the playing field has been tilted towards incumbent linear models. And going back to our earlier interviews, we'd heard that there could be lobbying forces at work seeking to keep it that way. So this is something that I decided to pick up with Chief Sustainability and External Affairs Officer at SUEZ in the UK, Adam Reid, and SUEZ in the UK is yet another Circular Economy Task Force member.
One of the things that we heard in our background research was that it's been quite difficult to get previous governments to act a lot on this front because there's so many vested interests that either in reality would be harmed or it's perceived that they would be harmed. And we heard about lobbying forces, both in terms of companies that are linear and in terms of waste management companies, who people felt were preventing this agenda from making headway. Obviously, SUEZ has been very, very vocal in its support for a circular economy and also in transforming the business from an outside perspective. This is what we can see in transforming the business so that it's ready for a circular future. I was hoping you could tell us why you've done that and what the sort of case as you see it is for actually being much more ambitious on this agenda than the government has been willing to be.
Yes, I think SUEZ have spent quite a bit of time in the last decade now trying to work out where is the future of our sector, because that linear model, the hump it and lump it kind of approach is just, it's on borrowed time, and it has been for a while. Let's be honest, landfill tax, carbon taxation, the future was pretty obvious some time ago. So I think, we've had reuse shops at many of our HWRCs for a decade, and we've grown those, and we've started to learn about that experience of how the customer sees, pre-loved items, but also how you can provide a logistics network to make that work. And that's culminated in creating something like the Renew Hub in Manchester, which is an under one roof repurposed composting hall that has upcycling, repair, bike repairs, furniture work, and the list is almost endless. And by working in collaboration with a customer like that, you can really start to deliver so many more benefits than just material value. And I think it's not about the carbon saving, it's not about the recycling rate, they're part of it, but it's about recognising that there's a social value from the training. There's an opportunity to put materials back into low-income households, and so that you get a different social benefit. So I think the learning curve has been really interesting. What I say is our energy from waste solution will always reduce the tonnage we handle, because we're moving more material up the hierarchy and ultimately not into the waste stream at all. It'll be a cleaner materials going back into a better designed solution that's got more circular systems and a longer embedded lifetime. But that takes time, and therefore you can't just move straight out of one technology and into a circular future without spending time with customers on the transition. And Greater Manchester is a good example of that transition at the moment, but we're expecting others to be expecting those kinds of solution to come forward more often and more quickly, now that we've proved that the point is not only deliverable, but is feasible and is viable at a scale that we think is necessary to enable a transition to be real. So I think, we're part of the journey and we're constantly learning, but there's definitely an acceptance that this has to be the journey you go on. There is no future for a linear waste management model, and anybody that tells you so is probably missing the point.
So there you have it. It was great to hear from a company that has grown out of the linear model that there's ultimately no future in linearity, and that there really is no option but to change, as businesses, as a society, as an economy. I think that the government's circular economy strategy does offer a unique opportunity for change, and we'll be pushing for it to be as ambitious as possible and to overcome the barriers and avoid the pitfalls that we heard about with previous attempts to move this agenda along.
Thank you for listening to this Green Alliance podcast. Keep checking in, as we will continue to bring you specialist interviews and highlights from our events here on your podcast feed. You can subscribe on your favourite podcast app, and you can follow us at Green Alliance UK on X and Green Alliance on LinkedIn and Blue Sky. We encourage you to use the hashtag Green Alliance Podcast to join in on this conversation and share thoughts, questions and ideas. See you next time.